I like movies, and I like good stories. And one of the stories that is a really good story, it's a tragic story. You've seen it on movies and in musicals, Les Miserables. And it's such a tragic story because you see this character written by Victor Hugo who is just wanting to take care of some basic family needs. And there's just tragedy after tragedy that takes place. It's a story of desperation. And often people will do extreme things when they're facing desperate circumstances in desperate times. Think of my own life. There have been times where I felt like I just didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how things were going to work out. I was at my end's wit. It was like, how am I going to provide for my family? Times when I was working 3 part-time jobs just to put food on the table, and I was wondering, what are we going to do? But one of the things as I was facing those difficult times, I said what I was doing was honest, ethical, and legal. And for these reasons, I could rejoice. And as we're coming off of the Thanksgiving season and Thanksgiving this past Thursday, it's important to remember that even in times of desperation, that we need to remain thankful. Even when circumstances are bad, we can still have hope. And so it's appropriate that this first message in the new series in the book of Ruth, a story of redemption, with a title of a message called A Story of Desperation, falls on the Sunday of Advent where we look at hope. Because this is indeed a tragic story. It is a story of extreme desperation. But as we will see as we move through the book of Ruth, it's a story of great hope as well. To give you a little bit of background, we finished our series in Joshua, and after Joshua's death, they entered into the Bible, which was called the time of the Judges. And the story of Ruth takes place during this period of the Judges. Now, to let you know a little bit about when it was written, because of some of the details of what were laid out in the book of Ruth, it was probably written sometime after 1010 BC, after David had ascended to his throne, because it's looking back and it's giving information about the genealogy of David as king in this book of Ruth. And so we see this as a book that was written during a time of the Judges, and the time of the Judges was a time that was not a particularly glorious time in the nation of Israel. It says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there was no king. And so we see a lot of permissiveness that was characterized throughout the book of Judges, and this is consistent with what we see in this book of Ruth. To give you a little bit of background, the book of Ruth takes place primarily in Bethlehem, which makes it another great link for our Advent series as we look to Bethlehem. But Ruth was a Moabite woman, and she is the only Gentile woman in the Bible that has a book named after her. She's one of 2 women. One was Esther, a Jewish woman. The other was Ruth, a Gentile woman. No other Gentiles had books named after them but Ruth. She was a Moabitess, and that meant she came from the region of Moab, of the nation. She was a Moabite by nationality. And to give you a little bit of history about how the Moabites came about, if you remember back in history when Abraham traveled from Ur of the Chaldeans of Babylon over to the land of Canaan, he came with his nephew Lot. Now Lot and Abraham traveled together, but then they got too much, their herds got too big, so Abraham said to Lot, go where you want. And so Lot said, I'm going to take this fertile land down in the plains on the east side of the Dead Sea. And it was in the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, and so that's where Lot set up. Now, if you remember the story, because of the immoralities of Sodom and Gomorrah, God judged them, and he rained down fire upon them and destroyed those cities. And Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, but Lot escaped with his 2 daughters. Now, it gets PG-13, guys, so I'll try to tone it down, but I'll let y'all figure it out. So in the context of desperation, Lot's unmarried daughters engaged in incestuous activity, and the result of that were 2 sons, Ben-Ami and Moab. And so the Moabites were the result of this illicit relationship. And as a result, the Moabites also developed their own idolatry, and they had this god called Chemosh. And Chemosh was a god that was similar to the gods that were worshipped in the land of Canaan that Israel had just conquered. You may have heard of the god of Baal, or Baal, and then there was the female version of Baal, which was Ashereth. And so you had Baal and Ashereth in Canaan, and you have Chemosh, this false god over in Moab. And so this is the context as we look into the book and the story of Ruth. But before I get into the details of our message for today, let's open in a word of prayer. Father God, I thank you that in the midst of our desperation, you are the God who gives us answers and solutions. You are the God that gives us hope. Help us to live in that hope in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, the main idea for today, as we look at this story of desperation, in a bigger narrative of a redemption story, is that at our most desperate times of life, the God of all hope never abandons us. We all face times in our lives where we feel that desperation, some more intense than others. But it's important to remember in the story of desperation today that the story is not over. This is the beginning. This is chapter 1 of 4 parts. But we see that in our most desperate times, when we think there is no hope, the God of all hope never abandons us. And this is what we need to remember and what we need to hold on to. As we examine Ruth chapter 1 today, we'll learn 3 factors about making decisions. And the first decision relates to decisions driven by desperation. We read about that in verses 1 through 5, decisions driven by desperation. You see, there's an undesirable circumstance that is here. And we all face undesirable circumstances in our lives. But these undesirable circumstances that this family was facing led to total desolation. Security was gone. It was wiped out. We'll pick up in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. You can follow along in your Bibles. Devices are on screen. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her sons and her husband. This is really a desperate situation. We see this woman, Naomi. She goes with her husband and her 2 sons to the land of Moab. Now, it was probably because of some famine that was going on. This event probably took place in a similar time frame of the famous judge Gideon, when that was taking place. And so they travel, they must have heard that there was food in the land of Moab, so they cross over from their homeland of Judah in Bethlehem area. They cross the Jordan River to the east side of the Jordan and go south to the land of Moab, and that's where they're residing. And so they're just survival. So he leaves. We don't know all of the circumstances of why he left, but they go into the situation when we know that they are a people who are prohibited from being part of the community of God. The Moabites were not allowed to be a part of God's community because of the idolatrous practices that they had. And so they go over there. So their displacement was driven by famine. They had to go to this foreign country, which was about 50 miles away. Now, for us, that doesn't seem like too far, but when you're walking everywhere, 50 miles is a fair bit. You're separated from your support network. And so this famine was the circumstance that resulted in their displacement to go to this land of Moab, where there was idolatry and practices and the oppressive people that were there. You know, there were some cultural implications of this decision to survive. They had to leave their home. And we don't know what the perception was for Elimelech and Naomi and the boys as they left. Were they being perceived by their own family members as just cutting their losses and running away, abandoning everybody else? There were some cultural implications that Elimelech and his wife would go over to those Moabites who are oppressing us. Why would they go over to live in the land of the enemy, the people who are oppressing us? And then there was the cultural implications for when they arrived there. What are these Israelites doing coming over here? You know, we are crushing them. We're oppressing them. What are they doing coming over here? It looks like on both ends that they were experiencing some severe cultural implications from this displacement that was taking place in their moment of desperation. But there was also spiritual implications of this displacement. They were leaving the security of living in the land of Israel where God was honored and going over where the idolatrous gods of Chemesh were worshipped. What's going to take place over there when they're separated from the community of faith? Would they face temptations? Of course they're going to face temptations. Would they succumb to the temptations when they're living in this idolatrous land? Or would they have a testimony as they're going over there? Or would they cave in and lose their good testimony as they're living in this amidst spiritual darkness in the land of Moab? We see that in the first couple of verses, but in verses 3 to 5, we see how the desperation increases. It goes from displacement due to famine to desperation caused by death. In verses 3 through 5, we hear that the husband, Elimelech, died, but she's got the two boys. And so she at least has a source of protection. When Elimelech dies, there's an increase of vulnerability to attack because the head of the household is removed. But still, she had two sons. So it wasn't complete devastation, but she had some resources with her sons who could work and provide for her. But when the sons died, the financial support was eliminated. So it went from bad to worse. They were displaced. Then death strikes her husband. Then death strikes her two sons, removing the physical protection, removing the financial protection. And also, there was a lack of spiritual protection as well. Now she's exposed and vulnerable, no connection to the faith community. And that's the context of what's taking place here, because they were worshiping false gods in Moab. We see that in this context, the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, took wives, Orpah and Ruth. And we see that with these women, now Naomi has some decisions to make. You know, bad decisions that are often entered out of feelings can lead to poor decisions. Because the feelings cause us to feel desperate, and when we're feeling desperate, we can often make really unwise decisions. That's why we can't make decisions based on the feelings of the moment, but have to look at the truth in the context so that we don't make rash decisions based on emotions. Say Moab was a place where they had actually cursed the people of Israel. Moab was a difficult place. So now we have to ask ourselves, what are the undesirable factors in your life that are impacting your decision-making processes that are contrary to faith? We have to make choices. But are the circumstances in our life going to push us to make rash decisions based on emotions and feeling, or are they going to drive us to make faith-based decisions? We have to be careful not to let the desperation to drive our decisions in a way that are emotionally based and lead to devastation. Well, we've seen that decisions that are driven by desperation can be very difficult and they have implications. But also the second factor that we discover from Ruth chapter 1 relates to the implications of decisions driven by authenticity. We read about that in verses 6 through 18. You see, the good thing that came out of this bad situation were the two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. Because they were valued relationships, and there were kindness, and there were connections in these relationships. Pick up with me in verse 6 as we read. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for this is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Well, in this first section of 6 through 14, we see great kindness displayed here. There was great kindness that flowed from those valued relationships, and that great kindness was expressed between Naomi and her daughters-in-law. What a touching scene that we see here, because God opened a pathway for Naomi to return out of this devastation. So we see God's kindness towards Naomi. She had heard that God was providing food in Israel. So now she could leave the land of Moab, the land of danger, a land of financial insecurity, a land of spiritual insecurity, to return home to her home area in Judah. And so her two daughters are walking with her along the road, and they're going to go with her. And then she says, "No, go back." Because, there's food there, but go back. What can I do to help you? Now, might seem a little strange, but she was showing kindness to her daughters-in-law in a certain way by saying go back, because they were kind to her. See, the daughters-in-law were kind to Naomi both in life and in death. They were with her through the death of Elimelech, and they stayed with her even after the death of their own husbands to support her. But Naomi says, you're throwing all in with me. You're supporting me, but I have nothing to offer you. I have no financial resources. I have no protection for you. And I can't provide a husband for you. Now, we're going to get into some cultural aspects of what all of this discussion about, because it might seem a little bit confusing. But Naomi was showing great kindness to her daughter as she was returning home. And even though they were protesting and saying, "We want to go with you," she was being very pragmatic. She says, "I'm too old. I can't provide for you." See, there's something that was taking place that the girls understood. And that was something that was that we discover in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 6. It's called a levirate marriage. And what happened in Israel, there would be provision for the young widows if their husband died. If a family had an unmarried younger brother, then that was the responsibility of the unmarried younger brother to take on the widow of his brother as wife, so that they could provide for the family. And also, if that wife didn't have any children, to provide a lineage or heritage for the brother. Now, this is something that's very interesting, because we see this taking place actually from Judah, for whom the tribe of Judah was named. He had sons who were and Onan, and one of them died, and Onan was supposed to fulfill his responsibility for his older brother, but he didn't do it. And that resulted in a whole nother fiasco that we don't have time to unpack here. But this was something that was understood in the culture of the time. And so Naomi is saying, "Look, I'm old. I can't, even if I got married today, I can't have kids. And even if by some miracle I was able to have kids, are you girls going to wait for those boys to grow up enough to become your husbands?" And so she is showing a genuine act of kindness. They were showing kindness to her by saying, "We'll go with you. We will support you." And she's showing kindness to them, saying, "No, go back. Find peace in your own home with your husband." So basically she's saying, "I can't provide husbands for you because I'm not going to bear children. So you go back to your father's household and marry a Moabite. They can provide for you. That way you won't be financially destitute." But the girls, they protested. They want to go with you. And she says, "No, I can't do that." And so she's going back. And so after Naomi and Orpah and Ruth have this discussion, Orpah, she sees the pragmatic result, and she goes back. She kissed her mother and said goodbye. But Ruth clung to Naomi. We pick up in verse 15. It says, and she said, see, your sister has gone back with her people and to her gods. Return after your sister. Now, that's a little bit disturbing that she's sending her daughter-in-laws back to idolatry, but there was a pragmatic side, and when you're in desperate situations, you make bad decisions, and that was probably not one that we want to look at, but we want to focus in on what takes place next. And those are the words of Ruth. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. We see in this situation of decisions that are driven by authenticity, we see the kindness in the relationships between Naomi and her daughters-in-law, but we see the connection that takes place in the words that Ruth spoke to her mother-in-law, Naomi. This is a passionate speech. We often hear people saying this in weddings, but this is not about a marriage relationship. This is about a relationship of a mother-in-law with her daughter-in-law. And the daughter-in-law is valuing the connection to Naomi interpersonally, but it goes so much deeper than that. There is a spiritual connection. Ruth takes a bold stand. She says, I'm not going back to Moab. I'm not going back to my father's household where he could find a husband for me because I'm a widow. But I am not going back to those gods of Chemosh. I am going back with you, to the land of Israel, to the one true God of the universe. I'm going with you. Ruth, she takes a bold stand because she has this connection, this interpersonal relationship to Naomi, who was her mother and a spiritual mother. She knew that when she said, you're going back to your gods, that was probably not really what Naomi wanted, but from a practical standpoint, she knew that she couldn't provide for them, but she was connected to Naomi. But Ruth also saw a connection to Naomi's nation, the nation of Israel. She was leaving her geographic home to go to a new geographic location 50 miles away that she had never known. She was going back to a new ethnic group, a people group, the land of Israel, the tribe of Judah, the people of Ephrathites in the city of Bethlehem. But more than going back with her mother-in-law, more than going back to a nation, she was going back to Naomi's God, the one true God. The only tangible benefit that Ruth would merit by going with Naomi was the faith community of the one true God. It would have been much wiser for her from a financial standpoint, from an interpersonal relationship standpoint, to stay in Moab. But the connection to God and the trust in God, the God of all hope, the God who was the object of her faith, made it wise for her to make a decision based on the authenticity and the truth of the moment, which was contrary to the emotion of the moment. So she goes up and she goes with Naomi to return. You see, the cost was very high. The cost meant she was leaving her own home. There was a cost of conversion as well. She was going back to a people who had rejected her people. That the people of Moab could never be integrated into the people of Israel. She was an outsider. Her people were oppressing the people of Israel. So a conversion from the gods of Chemosh to the gods of Israel was going to have a cost of conversion. It would be possibly ostracized by the people that she was going to, and possibly rejected by her own people as well. You know, often conversion to a foreign god is viewed as national treason. That's why it's so difficult for a person who is from a Muslim background is to make a conversion, because they view Islam as a complete way of life, and if you leave that religion, you're guilty of national treason. But conversion also has a cost of spiritual apostasy and family rejection, because what happens when a person turns away from the religion of their family, often they're ostracized because of that commitment to follow the truth and worship the true God. It often results in excommunication, shunning, disassociation, and renunciation. Ruth was making a commitment to go with Naomi at possibly a very high personal cost because it was a decision that was driven by authenticity. Well, what relationship is God urging in your life to guide your decision that are in alignment with faith? See, God brings people into our lives. And those people can either lead us closer to God or they can lead us away from God. And so we need to enhance those relationships that are going to help us to grow in our faith and commitment to God versus relationships that will take us away from a commitment to the Lord. That does not mean that we don't share the gospel with the lost. That does not mean that we don't reach out to the lost. Yes, we develop relationships with non-believers, but our closest relationships, the ones that speak truth and influence us, should be relationships that are committed to Christ, that will encourage us to live lives of holiness, that will encourage us to live transformed lives. Yes, we want to have connections so that we can win others for Jesus, but we don't want those other influences to draw us away from God. And Naomi made a decision to go with Ruth rather than remain in that particular context of darkness in Moab. This leads us to the third factor that we learn from Ruth, the chapter that addresses the negative component when people make decisions to validate distortions. In verses 19 through 22, we see that bad experiences can lead to incorrect conclusions. So in verse 19 it says, "So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And there they came to, and when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, 'Is this Naomi?' She said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?' So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest." You see, with all of the desperation that Naomi was going through, she made a decision that was validating a distortion of reality. Yes, she had been through some hard things, and we don't want to minimize the loss that she experienced, but she came to some wrong conclusions. She made a choice of bitterness. She was bitter. And it's important to understand that bitterness is a choice flowing from an experience that became for her an identity. She took on the identity of bitterness. Now, Naomi was known. It's been about 10 years. And so she goes back to Bethlehem. And the interesting thing is that her name, Naomi, means pleasant. And so here is this pleasant woman coming back, and she's saying, "Don't call me pleasant. I'm done with pleasant. God has struck me. God has dealt bitterly with me, so call me Mara," which means bitterness. Call me Mara. God has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but he brought me back empty. It's interesting, but don't want to talk about myself a whole lot, but sometimes it's appropriate. But when we came back from, and I may have mentioned this before, but for some it's new information, when we came back from France, I went through grief counseling. And when I went through this grief counseling, I was just devastated because we had lost a ministry. We came back. We didn't want to come back. It was hard. It was financially hard. It was emotionally hard. It was interpersonally hard. I didn't know what I was going to do in ministry. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have any answers. Me, the answer man, had no answers. And so what do you do when you don't have any answers? You go to somebody who can help you. There's no shame in seeking counseling when you are having issues. Sometimes those issues are deep-seated, and we need to talk to somebody who is specialized, who can help us work through some of those deep-seated issues in our lives. When we deny those deep-seated issues, they fester in us, and sometimes we're not even aware that they're there. And so it's helpful to talk to somebody who can help us work through these things. So I went in for some counseling. Now, this was at a time when it wasn't common for Christians to get counseling. And so it could be looked upon as being weak, but I went in for counseling. And the counselor said, Jeff, you don't do bitterness well, and you don't do self-pity well. He goes, you're like a child who is on the side of the road and somebody has thrown a bunch of manure on you, and you're just wanting people to look at you and say, well, look at me. And I was like, no, I'm not a victim. But what was helpful was understanding that I was trying not to be bitter. He goes, Jeff, you're not trying not to be bitter. You're bitter. And the more, until you recognize that you're bitter, you're just going to chew on it and chew on it and chew on it, swallow it and poop it out. Sorry to be a little bit graphic. But get rid of the bitterness. Don't say you're trying not to be bitter. And so part of that process was dealing with the bitterness so that my bitterness didn't become an identity. Naomi allowed that bitterness to become her identity, and she did so at the accusation that God was dealing unjustly with her. Cannot wallow in self-pity and bitterness, but we can get help who can help us to have the right perspective versus a distorted perspective. Naomi would have benefited from some time with Barry Bowden. But she was empty. You see, the Lord, He gives and He takes away, but He's not malicious. He is good all the time. And so part of it was helping her to get away from her misidentification as being bitter, and also for her misidentification of being as a God who empties us out. God is the one who fills us up. He is a God of abundance. He is not a God of depletion. Yes, bad things happen. Sometimes God uses bad things in our lives to get our attention so that we can empty our lives of the things that are contaminating us so that we can be filled up with Him. But He is not a God who empties us out for the sake of meanness. And so she had an improper view of herself and her own identity, and she had an improper view of God and His perspective as well. So she blames the God who blesses, and then she is blind to the own blessing that she has. The blessing that she had was her daughter-in-law, Ruth, this Moabite woman who was her unexpected treasure. And so as we look at this story, it is a story of desperation, and it ends in a way that doesn't look very positive. But the thing that we need to take away today is that this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the story, and this is a story of hope. And the hope is that they are back now, after this time of desperation, in their home area with Ruth the Moabite woman, who is Naomi's hidden treasure. And as we look forward in this series, we will learn more about what that blessing is. But the thing that we need to ask ourselves right now is, what are the lies and the temptations that we face that are causing us to doubt our true identity in God and the character of God? Because there are lies that we face, and we need to turn away from them. The thing that we need to remember as we look at this situation of desperation, that in our most desperate times of life, the God of all hope will never abandon us. Whatever your situation is, you have a next step to take. That next step might mean turning away from bitterness, making a decision not to identify yourself incorrectly in a moment of desperation, and take a distortion and embrace it as true, that I'm not lovable, that I can't change, that God's not good. And to take on the identity that you have in Christ Jesus. It might be that you have to change your perspective of God, that God is just looking to beat me up. He's not trustworthy, and He's not a God who provides. But He is the God of all hope, and He is the God who can transform your life today. If you've never come to know Jesus Christ as your personal Savior and Lord, today is the day where you can have hope for eternity and hope in the here and now. God is the God who can speak into your desperate situation and give you hope, because God is the God of all hope. And your story is not over yet. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.